University of Denver, the Center for Middle East Studies, and an assistant professor of communications at the University of North Alabama. And after we hear his remarks, perhaps we can get back to Joe Stork at Human Rights Watch. But Dr. Mohamed, please continue.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm going to get right into this because I have a lot to cover in a limited amount of time. I'm a media researcher, so my focus is on what the Egyptian media have been up to over the past year and before that. What happened in Egypt was not just a military coup, but as I've been writing for some time and as many others have been writing, it is and was a campaign of elimination. It was a campaign to eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood, the group that had won 5 consecutive free and fair elections, and also all competition, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but all competition. So on July 3rd, 2013, it wasn't just the case that the elected president was removed from office, but in fact, the elected president was arrested. His entire presidential team was arrested. Arrest warrants were prepared, hundreds of arrest warrants were prepared for political leaders. All of the oppositional television networks, every single oppositional television network was shut down. And that was just on July 3rd. In the days and weeks and months that followed, a series of massacres were carried out. We're talking today about Rabaa, but there were several other massacres. We have estimates range from 2,000 to 4,000 people killed in total. More than 40,000 people have been arrested. More than 20,000 people are still in jail. Political Islam has been banned. Islamist-run charities have been banned. The Muslim Brotherhood has been labeled a terrorist organization. The definition of terrorism has been expanded so broadly that it now includes as terrorism acts that, quote, harm national unity or, quote, hinder the work of educational institutions. So if you hold a protest on a college campus, that is an act of terrorism, and you will go to jail for quite a long time. So this is a campaign of elimination. And again, not to eliminate only the Muslim Brotherhood, but to eliminate all competition. Just as a kind of an anecdote, I was in Egypt on January 14th of this year when the referendum was taking place, the referendum on the Constitution. I drove through intentionally 5 different cities on that day, and I saw literally thousands of advertisements on billboards and flyers and posters that said, vote yes for the Constitution. Does anybody have a guess as to how many vote no signs I saw? You're a smart crowd. I didn't see any. And there's good reason, because the people that tried to put vote no signs up were arrested. So this is and was a campaign of elimination. There's been mass repression in the aftermath of the coup. We're seeing much of that today, some of the video evidence and other evidence. I'm interested in, how do we justify this? How do you justify these acts of mass repression for an entire population, right? It wasn't enough to describe the Muslim Brotherhood and others affiliated with the government, the former government, or their sympathizers or supporters. It wasn't enough to describe them as incompetent. That just wouldn't have done it. It wouldn't have been enough to say they're incompetent and they're exclusionary or they have a narrow agenda. Frankly, and I think Egyptians know this, many politicians are incompetent and have narrow agendas. So that wouldn't necessarily justify a military coup. And it certainly wouldn't justify this campaign of elimination, these mass slaughters that we've seen. So what was needed was something more. What was needed was something more. And here we have a series of discursive constructions of the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters as being un-Egyptian, foreign to Egypt, treasonous, and criminal. So how do we justify this? To the average Egyptian? Well, you tell him or you tell her that the Muslim Brotherhood is a foreign group. They're not of us. They're not from us. right? And they're also, to boot, criminals. They're terrorists. And this is what's happened. I mean, that's just a very broad kind of overview. I have a lot of evidence that I could unpack. I'll only be able to scratch the surface with you today. But before I talk about some of these discourses in a little bit more detail, let me just say something about Egyptian journalism. There's a pretty extensive body of literature now on Egyptian journalism. I happen to do my PhD dissertation on the Egyptian press system. And very briefly, because I think there's a tendency to want to compare, inherently we do that as humans. So if we think of Egyptian print journalism, we think of, American print, newspapers, the New York Times or whatever. If we think of Egyptian broadcast journalism, we might think of CNN, right? Well, it's very different in Egypt. Egyptian journalism scores very low on several different measures of professionalism. So education of journalists is very poor. Training is either poor or non-existent in many cases. Many journalists graduate from college and they don't know how to write a news story or carry out an interview, quite literally. These are the things that I learned when I was doing my dissertation, when I was doing my field research. There are problems with the journalistic ideology. Here, the ideology, for all of its problems, and there are numerous problems with the American press system, we could talk about that on another day, but here, for all of the problems, the dominant ideology is detachment, neutrality, balance, fairness, objectivity. That's what journalists strive for most of the time in this country. Now, they oftentimes fall very short, but at least that's what they're kind of aiming for. In Egypt, we have an entirely different situation. So Professor Abdullah Schleifer, when he was doing some of his research, he found that the journalists there in Egypt, many of them told him that they were activists, first and foremost, right? A journalist in the United States would say, I'm a watchdog, a typical journalist. When I was doing research in 2013, this is in May of 2013, my research team and I, we carried out interviews with journalists, and they explained to us how they intentionally biased news reports against Mohamed Morsi and against the Muslim Brotherhood. And they saw no problem with this. They thought this was just this was their national duty. Okay. If you look at some of the recent discourses, Khairi Ramadan, Ibrahim Isa, and other prominent broadcasters, these are Anderson Cooper-like figures. I figure since we're close to CNN, it's appropriate to make an Anderson Cooper reference. These are Anderson Cooper-like figures in Egypt. They have come out in recent months and said, you need to give us the credit for the glorious revolution of July 3rd. They think it's, they consider it a revolution, not a military coup. They're saying, give us the credit because, as Khairi Ramadan said, we assassinated the character of Mohamed Morsi. As Ibrahim Isa said, we are the ones who knocked the Muslim Brotherhood off their pedestal by spreading all of these rumors about them. And I'll talk about some of those in a minute. Here it's very typical, even on Fox News, you will find a point and a counterpoint. Now, Fox News, don't get me started. I know that there are numerous problems, but even on Fox News, to be fair, there is at least some attempt to hear another point of view. Now, frequently they'll attack that other point of view, but at least it's there on some occasions. In Egypt, we don't get this in most cases. It's very common to have a talk show, and I was doing a lot of research in 2012 and 2013. You'll have 4 guests on a talk show, a news talk show, and they're all saying the same thing. There's no debate at all. 4 guests. I was watching on TV once a show, they had 9 consecutive guests on over a 75-minute span, all saying the same thing. So there's really, and this is very common, this is very typical. So this is just a little bit of background. I think it's important to kind of contextualize this a little bit. Now let me look a little bit at some of what was being said and what is still being said in Egypt to give you a sense. Well, how are Egyptians, at least some Egyptians, I mean, we have to be honest. I mean, Egypt is very split according to the empirical data that we have. Millions of people are opposed to the coup, but millions of people support it and support Sisi. Maybe it's 50-50, maybe a little bit more, maybe it's a little bit less. So how do all these people support what is clearly a very repressive campaign and agenda? I mean, people are being killed in the streets, quite literally. Well, The Muslim Brotherhood in 2013, and especially after the military coup, was described as a foreign organization. As Gamal al-Ghitani, a famous analyst and writer, said, the Muslim Brotherhood governance in Egypt constitutes a foreign occupation of the country. So they're not Egyptians, right? We have lots of stories talking about the Muslim Brotherhood's close relationship to Israel, believe it or not. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but these are stories that you can read in the Egyptian mainstream newspapers about the Muslim Brotherhood's close relationship to Barack Obama in the United States. And I have to point this out. In this era of hyper-nationalism in Egypt, the United States and Israel have been set up as the enemies of Egypt. And Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is the one who is protecting Egypt from the United States and from Israel. And so to say that the Muslim Brotherhood are in bed with Israel and the United States is a major indictment. One of the mainstream daily newspapers in Egypt that left ran a headline which said, Barack Obama, the American president, is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were uncovering some breaking,
Incidentally, I think the Tea Party was saying the same thing, but
sure, fair enough. We had stories about the Muslim Brotherhood's close relationship to Hezbollah, the Lebanese group, Iran, and importantly, since now this invasion of Gaza is still ongoing, to Hamas. This was something that was repeated ad nauseum in the Egyptian newspapers. And it wasn't just that the Muslim Brotherhood had close relationships with these countries, but it was, as the Akhir al-Nahar, one of the Akhir al-Nahar hosts said, these people should be tried for high treason. They had unlawful agreements with these countries, attempts to destabilize and ultimately destroy Egypt. So just to give you some tangible examples, Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood were accused of combining to instigate a mass prison break. Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood were accused of conspiring to kill the revolutionaries in 2011, those anti-Mubarak protesters. It was the Muslim Brotherhood, not the Mubarak regime, it was the Muslim Brotherhood who they were actually protesting. Apparently they killed themselves. They, along with Hamas, killed the protesters in Tahrir Square. And in another version of this narrative, they were joined by the Knights of Malta, middle-aged group. This is an actual headline now, I'm translating this. It says, this is from a left newspaper, this is a mainstream daily. The Knights of Malta and Hamas are behind the killings of the January 25th revolutionaries. That's not in The Onion. It's not, and it's not on the opinion page. This is a news headline. Okay, so it's not surprising. All of the anti-American sentiment, all of the anti-Palestinian sentiment that we see in Egypt right now. There's a ton of anti-Palestinian sentiment. The media, mainstream media in Egypt, are largely siding with Israel in the current episode. We've had CBC network, mainstream network, talking about Palestinian terrorism and talking about Israel's precision rockets, right? This is what we're finding. This is a major kind of change in Egypt. Even in Mubarak's era, we wouldn't find that kind of blatant support for a policy that is really directly responsible for killing large numbers of Palestinians, Gazans. Okay. So the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters, their sympathizers, the people that are protesting the coup, the people that are against the new order, the political order that was created on July 3rd, these people are not just incompetent. It's not just a matter of them not knowing what they're doing politically. No, these people are foreign. They're enemies of the state. We had news stories about the Muslim Brotherhood's desire to sell the pyramids. This is a serious news story. The Muslim Brotherhood was going to sell Mohamed Morsi. Some of the news stories suggested that a deal was already in place to sell the pyramids. There was another story. Again, these are ongoing stories. I'm not just sort of hand-picking singular reports and making a big show. These are ongoing stories. The Muslim Brotherhood was going to sell the Suez Canal to Qatar. And going back to Hamas in Palestine, the Brotherhood was going to, in an act of charity for their brothers in Palestine, they were going to give them the Sinai Peninsula. Not sell it, but actually just give them the Sinai Peninsula. So these are serious news stories. So the Brotherhood is a foreign group. On July 3rd, Lamis al-Hadidi, who's a very famous broadcaster, she said, "Egypt is coming back to us." She said, "No one can rape the people of Egypt, neither the French, nor the English, nor the Israelis, nor the Muslim Brotherhood." So you see the association there. Broadcaster Khairi Ramadan, another famous broadcaster, he said the Muslim Brotherhood does not understand the meaning of nation. He said they are foreign agents and unpatriotic.